I woke up shivering in my sleeping bag, the thin nylon of my tent doing little to stop the cold that had settled in overnight. The fire had burned down to embers, and a dampness hung in the air, the smell of pine and wet earth thick in my nose. I'd set up camp deep in the forest, farther than I'd ever gone before, drawn by the promise of untouched wilderness and complete solitude. I had packed light, carrying only what I needed for a couple of nights: a tent, some food, my knife, and my old .22 rifle in case I came across any small game. The plan was simple: hike out, spend a few nights alone, and clear my head. The world felt too fast lately, too crowded. Out here, there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I didn't expect to see another soul. The day before had been uneventful. I had hiked until my legs ached, picked a clearing near a creek, and set up camp. I hadn't noticed anything unusual, no strange sounds, no uneasy feelings. But now, as I sat up in my tent, rubbing warmth back into my fingers, something felt different. I stepped out of my tent, the morning fog clinging to the ground in thick patches. The fire pit was just as I left it, but my gear seemed wrong. My pack was still leaned against the tree where I had left it, but it looked slumped, as if someone had gone through it. My food bag was still tied up in the tree, untouched. The rifle was exactly where I had set it down by the tent flap. But the placement of everything felt slightly off, like someone had picked them up and put them back without quite remembering where they had been originally. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe I had been half asleep when I stowed my gear for the night. I had been exhausted from the hike after all. I shook it off and got a fire going, the crackle and warmth chasing away the early morning chill. I ate quickly, packed up a small day bag, and decided to explore deeper into the woods. If someone had been snooping around my camp, I'd see the signs. The forest was dense, the trees growing close together, their trunks thick with moss. The ground was uneven, covered in dead leaves and tangled roots. I moved carefully, scanning the ground for any fresh tracks, but there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of nature, the occasional snap of a twig under my own boots. I had been walking for maybe an hour when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. A tree, stripped of its bark in long, jagged gouges. The cuts were high up, too high for a deer or a small animal. It looked deliberate, the way the bark had been peeled away, the raw wood beneath exposed like old scars. I frowned, running my fingers over the rough grooves. A bear, maybe, but something about it seemed too precise. I kept going. The next sign came not long after. A crude wooden structure, half collapsed, hidden behind a cluster of trees. It looked like it had been there for years, the wood gray and splintered, covered in creeping vines. A hunting blind, maybe, or a shelter built by someone who had passed through long ago. But there were no footprints, no recent signs of life, just the silent, rotting wood. The feeling of unease that had started that morning grew heavier. I turned back, retracing my steps toward camp. I told myself it was just an old structure, that the gouged tree was nothing, but my gut told me otherwise. When I reached my campsite, the fire was out. That wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that the ashes had been kicked apart, scattered. My sleeping bag was dragged out of my tent, half unzipped. My pack was still there, but the contents had been dumped out, my gear strewn across the ground. My rifle was missing. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. I spun around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just silence. I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to think. Whoever had done this had to be nearby. They had taken my rifle but left my food, my knife, my gear. That meant they weren't just looking to steal, they wanted something else. I grabbed my knife and shoved what I could into my pack. I needed to get out, fast. I started back the way I had come, moving quickly, heart pounding. The woods felt different now, the trees pressing in, the silence too thick. I strained my ears, listening for movement, but there was nothing. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own breath, too loud in my ears. I walked fast, almost jogging, my boots slipping on the damp ground. I wasn't thinking about direction anymore. I just needed to put distance between myself and whoever was out there. Then I saw it. Another tree, its bark stripped away. But this one was fresh. The raw wood bright against the dark trunk. The gouges were deep, almost frantic. And just below it, in the dirt, were footprints. Not boots, bare feet. I ran. Branches whipped against my face. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see who was following me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I broke through the trees and onto an old, overgrown logging road. I followed it, my legs aching, until I saw my truck where I had left it, miles from where I had camped. The keys were in my pocket. My hands shook as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the main road, I looked back once. A figure stood at the tree line, watching. No clothes, bare skin streaked with dirt, eyes dark and unreadable. I drove until I was home. I never went back. I had spent most of my life hiking and camping in the deep woods. I always felt at home among the trees, away from people, noise, and everything that made life feel rushed. I liked being alone out there, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the distant calls of animals. But there was one trip, deep into Black Hollow, that made me question whether solitude in the wilderness was really what I wanted. Black Hollow was a stretch of dense forest in the mountains, barely touched by trails or maps. It wasn't well known, and I had only heard about it from an old topographical guide I picked up in a used bookstore. It was remote, with no established paths leading in or out, just miles of rough terrain. That was exactly what drew me to it. I planned a 5-day solo hike, packed my gear, and drove up as far as the back roads would take me. From there, it was all foot travel. The first day was peaceful, exactly what I wanted. I followed an old game trail, marking my route on my GPS and keeping an eye on my compass. The forest was thick, with towering pines and a canopy that let in only broken shafts of sunlight. Felt untouched, like I had stepped into another time. By the second day, I was deep in the heart of Black Hollow. The landscape had changed. The trees grew even closer together, the undergrowth thick and tangled. The ground was uneven, riddled with rocks and fallen logs. I found signs of old logging activity, rusted cables, half-buried metal, the remains of a collapsed wooden structure. It was clear that people had been here long ago, but nature had nearly erased all traces of them. Late that afternoon, I set up camp in a small clearing near a stream. It was a good spot, flat ground, access to water, plenty of cover. I made a fire, ate my meal, and settled in as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. The air cooled fast, and the usual nighttime sounds took over. Crickets, the occasional owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush. At some point in the night, I woke up, feeling uneasy. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes when the wind dies down or when animals go still. It was a thick, heavy quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I stayed still, listening. I couldn't hear anything, no wind, no insects, nothing. Then I caught the faintest sound. It was distant, almost impossible to place, but it sent a cold wave through my chest. A rhythmic crunch. Footsteps. They weren't fast, weren't trying to be quiet. Just slow, deliberate steps through the brush. I reached for my headlamp and flicked it on, sweeping the beam around. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I listened hard, but the sound had stopped. The silence had returned, thick and unnatural. My gut told me to stay alert, but exhaustion won out, and eventually, I fell asleep again. The next day, I pressed deeper into the hollow, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe an animal passing through. But something about the forest felt different that day. The deeper I went, the more I noticed things that unsettled me. Trees with deep, deliberate cuts in their bark. Piles of rocks stacked in odd formations. Pieces of old, rusted wire stretched between trees at knee height, like tripwires. I kept moving, telling myself it was all remnants of the old logging days. But by late afternoon, I came across something that stopped me cold. A clearing, but not a natural one. The trees had been cut, some hacked down in rough, uneven stumps. The ground was torn up, exposing dark, damp soil. In the center was a crude wooden structure, almost like a shack but with no walls. Just 4 posts and a slanted roof made of mismatched boards and tarps. Underneath it, the ground was disturbed, covered in what looked like old, rotting leaves and scraps of fabric. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but something caught my eye. A small, rusted can hanging from one of the posts. I stepped closer and saw that it was full of bones. Small, brittle bones. Animal, I hoped. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I grabbed my pack and forced myself to stay calm as I turned and walked away. I kept a steady pace, but I listened. Listened for movement, for breathing, for anything that would tell me I wasn't alone. I didn't stop that night. I hiked in the dark, only using my headlamp when necessary. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever that place was. By dawn, I was exhausted. I found a high ridge with a clear view of the valley below and took a break. As I sat there, eating the last of my food, I looked back the way I had come. The forest stretched for miles, dense and dark. But then something moved. Far below, near the tree line, a figure stepped out. Too far to make out details, but it was a person. They stood there for a long time, looking up in my direction. Then, without a sound, they turned and walked back into the trees. I left everything behind. My camp, my gear, even my sleeping bag. I moved fast, taking the shortest route back to my car. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, but I never saw the figure again. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking. I locked the doors the second I got inside and drove without stopping until I was miles away from Black Hollow. I don't know what I stumbled into out there. I don't know who was watching me or why they stayed out of sight. And I don't want to know. That was my last solo trip. I still hike, still camp, but never alone. And never anywhere near Black Hollow. I had been planning the trip for months. A solo backpacking trek deep into the northern Montana wilderness, miles from any road or marked trail. I had experience, years of it. Search and rescue, volunteer firefighting, dozens of solo camping trips under my belt. This wasn't my first time alone in the wild, and it wouldn't be my last. Or so I thought. The plan was simple. 5 days out, 5 days back. No designated trails, just an old forestry map, a compass, and my GPS as backup. I had my pack loaded with enough supplies to last me longer if needed. I wasn't worried. I had done trips like this before. The first couple of days went smoothly. The woods were thick, dense with pines and firs that blocked out most of the sun. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Wildlife was plentiful, elk, deer, even the occasional bear sign. I kept my camp clean, hung my food properly, stayed alert. Nothing unusual. By the third day, I was deeper in than I had ever been. The trees seemed older, thicker. I hadn't seen a sign of another human in days. Not even an old campsite, no trash, nothing. It was the kind of silence that presses against you, making your own breath seem too loud. It was that evening when I first noticed something was off. I had set up camp in a small clearing, cooking my evening meal as the last light faded. The fire crackled softly. I was tired but content, sitting against my pack, staring up at the stars as they blinked to life one by one. Then I heard it, something moving in the trees behind me. It wasn't the soft, aimless rustling of a deer or the light scurrying of a smaller animal. It was heavier, intentional, measured steps on the forest floor. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of my fire, but saw nothing, just endless trees, shifting slightly in the breeze. I listened, heart pounding a little harder than before, but the sound was gone. A bear, maybe, but a bear would have made more noise, would have sniffed, grunted, done something other than just stand there, watching. I forced myself to relax. I was being paranoid. Being this deep in the woods could mess with your head. The mind plays tricks when you're alone. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing. I packed up and moved on, hiking deeper into the wilderness, following an old game trail that wound between towering trees. The day passed without incident. I covered good ground, climbing higher into the hills. The air was crisp, cool. Perfect day for hiking. But that night, it happened again. I was camped near a small stream, boiling water for my meal when I heard it. Closer this time. The same careful, deliberate steps, stopping the moment I turned my head. The fire cast long shadows, but beyond them, the darkness was impenetrable. I stood, gripping my knife, scanning the treeline. Nothing. No eyes reflecting back at me. No movement. Just silence. A shiver crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone out here. I could feel it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small noise had me gripping my knife tighter. My instincts screamed at me. Something was wrong. By the next morning, I had made a decision. I was cutting my trip short. I wasn't scared of being alone in the woods. I wasn't scared of animals. But this was different. Something was out there. Something that didn't want to be seen. I started back, moving quickly. I stuck to my original route, but my pace was faster. My head was on a swivel, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that wasn't my own. That evening, I built my fire larger than usual. I wanted light as much as I could get. I barely ate, barely moved. I just sat there, staring into the trees, waiting. And then, just as the fire began to die down, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light, motionless. Too tall to be an animal, too still. My breath caught in my throat. My body screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but I just sat there, frozen. And then it stepped back, melting into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept my fire going, staring into the trees, gripping my knife until my fingers ached. I listened, but I didn't hear it again. By morning, I was moving before the sun had fully risen. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just packed and walked. I walked for hours, barely stopping to drink water. The feeling of being watched never left me. The hairs on my arms stood on end, my skin prickling with something primal. By late afternoon, I came across something that stopped me dead. Footprints. Not mine, not an animal's. Bare human footprints in the damp earth, following my path. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. And they weren't there when I passed this way the first time. I didn't think. I just moved, faster now, practically jogging through the trees, ignoring the burning in my legs. The sun dipped lower. I had planned to camp one more night, but that wasn't happening. I wasn't stopping until I was out. I pushed on through the dark, tripping over roots, branches scratching my arms. My legs screamed at me to stop, but I didn't. By the time I saw the first familiar landmark, dawn was breaking. I stumbled out onto the old logging road where my truck was parked, chest heaving. I turned once, looking back at the trees, half expecting to see something standing there, watching, but there was nothing, just the empty woods. I drove until I reached town, not stopping once. When I finally checked my gear, my food bag had been opened, not torn like a bear would, but unzipped. Someone had been in my camp, watching me, following me. I never went back to that stretch of woods again. There are places deep in the woods where no one should go, not because of superstition or old wives' tales, but because nature has a way of swallowing things whole. I learned that the hard way one summer when I took a solo trip into a stretch of national forest that hardly saw foot traffic. No trail markers, no clear paths, just an endless sprawl of pines and maples, tangled undergrowth, and silence so thick it pressed in on you. I was looking for solitude, a break from the world, but what I found was something else entirely. I had parked my truck on an old logging road about 20 miles from the nearest town and set out on foot with a heavy pack. My plan was to spend 4 days out there, moving deeper each day, setting up a new camp every night. I had a map and compass, a solid knowledge of backcountry navigation, and enough gear to keep me comfortable. The first day was uneventful, just miles of hiking and the occasional deer bolting through the trees at my presence. By late afternoon, I found a decent spot near a creek, set up camp, and got a fire going. That first night, nothing felt off. Just the usual sounds of the woods settling in, the chirp of insects, the rustling of small critters in the brush. The second day, I pushed farther in. The terrain got rougher, the hills steeper, the forest denser. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled across something unexpected. An old, abandoned structure tucked between the trees. It was small, maybe the size of a single-room cabin, but not built like one. The walls were thick, made of cinder blocks, the roof rusted metal. No windows, just a single heavy door, slightly ajar. It didn't look like a house, more like an old utility shed. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, it made no sense. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of damp and decay. The interior was mostly empty. Some rusted-out metal drums in one corner, an old wooden table, and in the back, a hatch set into the concrete floor. A metal ring was bolted to it, thick and rusted. Something about it made my stomach twist. I didn't touch it. Just looking at it made my skin crawl. I backed out of the shed and kept moving, but the feeling stuck with me. I made camp a good 2 miles away, but that night, sleep didn't come easy. The woods felt different, heavier. A snapping branch in the distance jolted me awake more than once. I told myself it was just the usual wildlife, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Day 3, I pushed even deeper. I was aiming for a ridge I had seen on the map, thinking it would give me a good vantage point. But the further I went, the worse it got. The forest floor turned soft, like it had been disturbed. Trees leaned at odd angles, their roots exposed and gnarled. Then I started seeing them. Pits, some no bigger than a bathtub, others wide and deep. Some looked fresh, the soil still loose, while others had been there long enough for weeds to grow. They weren't natural. Something had dug them. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. Stubbornness or stupidity, I kept going. The ridge was close and I wanted to see it. That's when I found the first one. A shoe, just sitting there on the ground near one of the pits. Old, rotted through, the laces gone. Nearby, a scrap of fabric tangled in the brush. It might have been from a jacket once, or a backpack. My gut twisted. My brain screamed at me to leave, but my legs carried me forward. The next pit was different. It had been filled in. The dirt was packed unevenly, chunks of wood and stone mixed in. And sticking out from the center, just barely visible in the loose soil, bone. Human bone. I don't remember how long I stood there, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it. My body screamed at me to run, but I didn't know which direction was safe. Then the worst sound I've ever heard in my life echoed through the trees. It was distant, but getting closer. A heavy, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the undergrowth. I dropped low, pressing myself against the ground, listening. My mind scrambled for logic. Maybe an animal, maybe just my paranoia twisting normal sounds. But then I saw them. 2 figures moving between the trees, dressed in dark clothing, dragging something heavy between them. I didn't wait. I turned and ran. No care for silence, no concern for direction, just away. Branches tore at my skin, my pack snagged, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs burned. Only then did I risk stopping, pressing myself into a thicket, trying to slow my breathing. I stayed like that for hours, listening. The woods were silent now, not even the usual sounds of birds or insects. I knew I had to move, but every direction felt wrong. My compass told me one way, but my gut screamed another. Eventually, I forced myself up and pushed on, retracing my path as best as I could. By the time I made it back to the logging road, the sun was dipping low. My truck was still there. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and sat there shaking. I expected to see someone come bursting from the woods at any moment, but no one did. I didn't stop driving until I hit town. I thought about going to the police, but what could I say? I found some holes in the woods, a shoe, A bone? Without exact coordinates, they'd never find it, and I wasn't about to go back. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I still hike, still camp, but never that deep, never alone. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some things are buried for a reason. I had planned this trip for months. A solo trek into the heart of the northern wilderness. Far from people, far from roads, far from everything. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was different. It was the most remote I'd ever gone. Miles past where the trails ended, deep into the thick of untouched forest. The kind of place where, if something went wrong, no one was coming. I parked my truck on the edge of a narrow dirt road, barely more than a deer trail at this point, and loaded up my pack. The late summer air was thick and still, the kind of quiet that only exists in places no one goes. I checked my map one last time, noted my route, and stepped into the trees. The first few miles were easygoing, cutting through patches of hardwood and rolling hills. The deeper I went, the more the land changed. The trees thickened, the underbrush tangled around my legs, and the ground grew soft with layers of damp moss. It was slow work, picking my way through untouched forest, but I liked it that way. This was exactly what I came for, the solitude, the stillness, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones. By the time I made camp that night, I was deep enough in that even the thought of other people felt distant. I picked a spot on high ground, away from the marshy lowlands, cleared out a small area, and pitched my tent. The forest around me was dense, almost suffocating. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, rich and thick. I built a small fire, ate my food in silence, and listened to the sounds of the night. First, everything seemed normal. The occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant call of something I couldn't identify. But as the night stretched on, the sounds changed. The usual background noise of the forest, the crickets, the frogs, the hum of insects, faded into something else, a kind of heavy silence, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes the woods just went quiet. Predators moving through, shifts in the wind, there were a dozen explanations. But then I heard it, a branch snapping, not the dry crack of a twig under a small animal, but the sharp, deliberate break of something heavy moving through the trees. It came from behind me, deep in the dark beyond the firelight. I turned slowly, my pulse kicking up. My headlamp cut through the black, but the forest was too thick. I saw nothing. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe even a bear. I was in their territory after all, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just the sound, it was the way the forest reacted to it. The way the quiet deepened, the way the normal night noises refused to return. I stayed up longer than I meant to, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I crawled into my tent, keeping my knife close. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks, just my mind making things worse than they were. But I didn't sleep well. The next day, I pushed deeper. The land grew rougher, the trees older. The forest floor was thick with fallen logs and twisted roots, the kind of terrain that felt untouched by time. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. Not bad exactly, just off. Like something about the place wasn't meant to be disturbed. I came across an old tree, massive and half-rotted. Its trunk split wide from a lightning strike years ago, and there, wedged deep in the wood, was something that didn't belong. A knife, rusted, old, its handle wrapped in what looked like leather. It had been there a long time, years at least. The wood had started to grow around it, swallowing it whole. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing with possibilities. Who had left it here? Why? I felt a strange urge to pull it free, but something in my gut told me to leave it alone. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I found a spot to make camp. It wasn't ideal. The ground was uneven, the trees pressing in too close, but I didn't have much choice. The sun was already dipping low, and I didn't want to be setting up in the dark. I cleared a small area, built a fire, and tried to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. That night, the silence came again, the kind that felt heavy, unnatural. And then the sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. Not an animal. Not the clumsy crashing of a bear. Not the light scurry of a deer. Something walking step by step just out of sight. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there, gripping my knife, listening. The steps circled once, twice. Then, just as suddenly as they came, they stopped. The forest fell back into its unnatural silence, and I was left sitting there, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I made the decision to turn back. I wasn't sure what I'd heard, what I'd felt, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I packed up quickly, barely stopping to eat, and started retracing my path. But something was wrong. The landscape didn't look the same. The trees were different. The ground felt unfamiliar. I checked my map, my compass, but they told me I was going the right way. My eyes told me something else. I pushed forward, moving fast, trying to shake the growing panic in my chest. Hours passed, the sun shifting overhead, and still, nothing looked familiar. I should have reached the old lightning-struck tree by now. I should have been getting close to the edge of the deep woods, but I wasn't. I was still in it, still trapped in the thick of trees that didn't belong. And then I saw it, a shape half hidden behind the trees. Person? No, not a person. A figure, tall, unmoving, watching. My heart pounded. I took a step back. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, barely visible through the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw something I recognized. A ridge, a break in the trees, a path I knew was right. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just moved, fast and desperate, until, finally, I broke free of the deep woods. When I reached my truck, I didn't look back. I just threw my gear inside, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what I heard. But I know this. Something was out there. Something that didn't want me there. And whatever it was, it let me go. I had spent the better part of a week hiking through dense forest, far from any established trails, deep in a stretch of untamed wilderness where the trees grew so thick that even midday sunlight barely reached the forest floor. It wasn't my first time doing a long, off-trail solo hike, but something about this trip felt different from the beginning. I had planned the route carefully, using old topographic maps and satellite imagery to chart a path through a remote stretch of forest where few people ever went. The goal was to follow an old logging road from the 1950s that had long since been swallowed by nature, using it as a guide toward a high ridge where I could camp for the night. The road had been visible from aerial photos, nothing more than a faint scar in the canopy, but on the ground, it was almost non-existent. Fallen trees, thick undergrowth, and decades of erosion had buried whatever remained beneath layers of moss and rotting leaves. I moved slowly, using my GPS and compass to navigate, checking my bearings every few minutes to make sure I was still roughly following the old road's path. As the sun started dipping lower, I knew I had to make camp soon. The air was cooling fast, the temperature dropping as it often did in these deep woods, where thick foliage blocked the last warmth of the sun. I found a small clearing near a rocky outcrop that looked like it would provide some shelter. The ground was flat enough for my tent, and there were no signs of recent animal activity. I set up camp, cooked a quick meal, and settled in for the night. The silence was absolute. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was the kind of silence that pressed in around you, made you hyper-aware of every small sound. I was used to it, but there was an odd weight to the air that night. I felt it creeping in around me, an unshakable sense of being watched. I forced myself to push the thought aside. I had been alone in the woods many times before, and I knew how easy it was for the mind to play tricks on itself. The unfamiliar terrain, the exhaustion from a long day's hike, it all fed into the feeling. I zipped up my tent, laid back, and listened to the distant sound of wind moving through the trees until I fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still, listening. The forest was dead silent. Not even the usual sounds of insects or distant owls. Just quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep outside my tent. It was close, not an animal. I knew the difference. This was slow, careful, the kind of movement that tried not to be heard. My breath caught in my throat as I listened. Another step, then another, stopped just outside my tent, unmoving. I reached slowly for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag, gripping it tight. My heart pounded. There was no light, and I didn't dare move to grab my flashlight. I just lay there, frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. Minutes passed, then more. I started to think maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the sound had been a branch falling or some other natural noise. But just as I started to let my guard down, there was a sharp, deliberate scratch against the fabric of my tent. Slow, just once, then nothing. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced through possibilities. Animal? No, animals didn't move like that. Another hiker? But I hadn't seen another person in days. No signs of campsites, no tracks, nothing. Whoever or whatever it was, they had stopped moving. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, knife still in hand, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won. I didn't sleep, but my mind drifted into that strange half-awake state where time passes in a haze. When the first light of dawn started creeping into the sky, I finally let myself move. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. The forest looked the same as it had the night before. I stepped outside, scanning the ground around my tent for tracks. There were none. The leaves were undisturbed, the dirt dry and compacted. But I knew what I had heard. I didn't bother making breakfast. I packed up camp in record time, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move faster. I wanted to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I checked my GPS, orienting myself toward the next ridge, and started hiking at a near jogging pace. The feeling of being watched never left. Every now and then, I would stop, listen, scan the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sounds. But I knew I wasn't alone. By midday, I reached a wide, shallow stream. It was an obstacle I had expected, a natural landmark that confirmed I was on the right path. I waded across, the cold water shocking against my skin, and climbed up the far bank. Just as I reached the top, I glanced back at the water. That's when I saw it. A single footprint in the muddy bank. Not mine. It was fresh, barely starting to fill with water. Large. Too large for me. I didn't hesitate. I kept moving, faster now, heart pounding. I told myself it had to be a mistake, that maybe I had misjudged the size. Maybe, but I didn't stop. I hiked harder than I ever had before, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring hunger. By late afternoon, I finally reached a ridge that overlooked a stretch of lowland forest. I pulled out my binoculars, scanning the area behind me. Nothing, but I wasn't convinced. I didn't stop until I reached a logging road several miles later, one that was still in use. The moment I stepped onto that dirt road, I felt a wave of relief crash over me. I was still deep in the wilderness, but I was back in an area where people occasionally passed through. I didn't see another person until the next day, when I finally reached a small outpost where I had planned to resupply. I never reported what happened. What would I even say? I never saw anything, never found real proof, just a feeling, a scratch on my tent, a footprint too large to be mine. But I never went back to that stretch of forest. I never hiked that deep alone again. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of roads and trails, something watches, something follows. And if you're unlucky enough to be alone out there, you might hear it too.